This is the WAIZOWL OGM Cloud V2 Crimson Lion Edition, a refresh of the legendary OGM Cloud V1 with many updates across the board, just like we saw with the OGM Pro's refresh. Now, I previously covered the OGM Cloud V1 a couple months ago, and I was quite impressed with that mouse overall. The shape being a rough clone of the SteelSeries Sensei Ten wasn't my personal favorite, but the performance and the overall quality of the Cloud V1 was superb. So in today's episode of the mel0n review, we're going to go through all the improvements here on the OGM Cloud V2. Big thank you to WAIZOWL, who was kind enough to send over the Cloud V2 Crimson Lion Edition for review. And as a reminder, as always, this video will be fully subtitled and timestamps available down in the video description. And if you enjoyed the video and want to see more reviews like this, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed. I will also have a full teardown for the Cloud V2 out in a couple days after this review goes live, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n review. First off, let's talk about unboxing. Similar to what we saw in the OGM Pro V2, the unboxing experience here for the Cloud 2 is very similar and has been significantly improved coming from the Cloud V1. The mouse comes in a box similar in style to the OGM Pro V2's packaging, just with an updated coloring and artwork to match the Crimson Lion theming. Inside we have the Cloud V2 itself with its unique Crimson Lion design. Underneath the mouse we have an 8K Hz polling dongle, which is the same shape as the Cloud V1 and OGM Pro V2's dongles, just with an updated coloring and design to match the Crimson Lion theming. Also included is a standard non-tilted USB A to C cable. This is the same cable that came with the OGM Pro V2 and the Cloud V1, which is disappointing to see, but I'll talk about why that is later. And just like we saw with the OGM Pro V2, the Cloud V2 does come with a set of WAIZOWL's fantastic grip tape, which I'm very happy to see return here again. We also have a full paper user manual included, and just like the OGM Pro V2, the Cloud doesn't come with any skates pre-installed, but instead comes with 3 options for stock skates: a full-size control set, a smaller surface area speed set, and a set of 10 dot skates. Now, I'll talk more in depth about the included grip tape, cable, and skates later on in this video, but just like we saw in the OGM Pro V2, the unboxing here for the Cloud V2 is fantastic. One of the better unboxing experiences I've seen from a premium mouse this year. In terms of build quality and QC here on the Cloud V2, just like we saw in the Cloud V1 and the OGM Pro V2, the mouse is essentially perfect in my eyes. The mouse's outer shell is extremely rigid and there's no creaking or flexing anywhere on the upper or lower shell, and over my testing, my unit never developed any issue areas, which is great to see. All the buttons on the mouse are also very well implemented with no issues that would affect their performance. We also have the same QC stickers we saw in the OGM Pro V2 return here on the Cloud V2, but thankfully the positioning of the stickers is much better than it was on the OGM Pro V2, being installed on the base of the 8K polling dongle and inside the base skate cutout on my unit, not on the front of the shell like it was on my OGM Pro V2 unit. Again, I'm very happy to see QC stickers here on these mice, and I wish more brands would do this. WAIZOWL just needs to be a little more consistent with their positioning. Now, in regards to the Cloud V2's stock skates, as I mentioned earlier, the mouse comes with 3 stock skate options: a full-size control set, a smaller surface area speed set, and a sheet of 10 dot skates. The mouse doesn't come with any skates pre-installed, just like we saw in the OGM Pro V2, which I really like, as it makes it very easy to install your preferred set of the included skates or aftermarket skates without having to go through the hassle of removing any pre-installed skates. This is a great change coming from the Cloud V1, as that mouse came with the speed stocks pre-installed, so if you wanted to use the included full-size stocks or your preferred set of aftermarket skates, you had to remove the pre-installed speed stocks, which was a less than ideal experience. So I'm very happy to see the same improvements that we saw in the OGM Pro V2 here on the Cloud V2, as it just makes the overall unboxing experience much better. But sadly, the stock skates themselves are the same dual layered filled 100% PTFE stock skates we saw in the OGM Pro V2 and the Vancer mice. Now, I talked about these in length in my review of the OGM Pro V2, so I won't go into too much depth here, but these skates are much softer than traditional 100% PTFE skates, so they're much more controlled than you would expect a set of stock skates to be. Now, for those of you who watch the channel for a long time, you'll know I generally don't like stock skates due to their unbalanced surface areas, but even the included dot skates, due to their weird softer material, are still far too controlled for my tastes, and I found aftermarket skates like the Extra Pad Obsidian Air, Jade Air, and the Ghost Glide Cyclones to be much more consistent and better performing than the included stock skates here with the Cloud V2. Now, just to be clear, I'm very picky about skates, and I just don't like stock skates, and I specifically don't like this softer kind of skate. So this is very much a me issue, but most people who have been using a mouse's stock skates for years now will be very happy with the Cloud V2 stocks. Just keep in mind they're going to be a lot slower than traditional 100% PTFE stock skates due to their softer material. Next up, let's talk about the Cloud V2 stock cable. As I mentioned earlier in this video, the mouse comes with the same stock cable that we've seen included with the OGM Pro V2 and the original Cloud V1. As I said in my Pro V2 review, I'm disappointed that the stock cable hasn't been improved coming from the OG Cloud, as the stock cable has a very rough outer paracord wrapping and is very rigid. It also has a non-tilted USB-C end. And because of the poor stock cable, the wired experience here in the Cloud V2, just like it was in the OGM Pro V2 and the Cloud V1, is less than ideal. Now, seeing as the Cloud V2 only supports 1K pulling over wired usage, admittedly the cable being subpar isn't the biggest issue, as you're only really going to be using it for charging the Cloud V2, but just like I said when I reviewed the OGM Pro V2, that doesn't excuse the poor cable here, as we've seen other mice like the Pulsar X2 series that also only support a 1K pulling over wired include cables that are significantly better than the cable included here with the Cloud V2. If we saw WAIZOWL update their cable to be one similar to the Pulsar stock cables, that would be a significant improvement and would make the wired experience here on the Cloud V2 as well as their other mice significantly better. Alright, let's talk about weight next. Now on the OGM Pro V2, the weight of the unit itself was fine, but when combined with the weight of the skates, it was well outside the advertised weight spec, and sadly we have the same situation here on the Cloud V2. Now WAIZOWL is advertising the Cloud V2 to weigh in at 55 grams with a plus-minus gram ratio of 2 grams. Weighing in my Cloud V2 in its stock configuration with no skates installed, my unit is weighing in at 56.64 grams, surprisingly similar to the Cloud V1's weight, which weighed in around 56.19 grams. But while this weight is technically within the spec because it is within the plus-minus 2 gram ratio, this is not including the weight of the skates, and if you add the skates into the equation, the full-size stock skates will increase the Cloud V2's weight by around 2.6 grams, the speed stocks will increase the weight by around 1.2 grams, and the dot skates, assuming you use all 10 of course, will bump the weight by an additional 0.6 grams. So in reality, the Cloud V2 will weigh anywhere from 57.24 grams to 59.24 grams, depending on what stock skates or aftermarket skates you use, which is well over the advertised weight spec of 55 plus minus 2 grams. So just like I said when I reviewed the OGM Pro V2, I'd love to see WAIZOWL update their marketing for the Cloud V2 to more accurately represent the true weight of the OGM Cloud V2. If the mouse was advertised as being 57 grams with a plus minus 2 gram ratio, that would be a much more accurate representation of the Cloud V2's true weight when you include the skates in the equation. Next up, let's talk about the Cloud V2 shape. The mouse's shape is still symmetrical, but it is optimized for right hand use. You can use the Cloud V2 with your left hand, but you won't have access to side buttons. And just like I said when I reviewed the Cloud V1, the Cloud V2 shape is very bulky. Being a Sensei 10 clone, this is to be expected, but it was a little too bulky for my hands. So keep this in mind if you're considering the Cloud V2, as it retains the same bulky feeling that the Cloud V1 had. If you're looking for a similarly shaped mouse to the Cloud but smaller, I'd keep an eye out for the Cloud S, which will be releasing in a couple months, as that is just going to be a mini version of the OGM Cloud shape. In terms of the Cloud V2 shell profile and characteristics, looking at the Cloud 2 from the top, we can see the large symmetrical shape with its hourglass-like curvature and wider rounded rear. Flipping the unit over, we can better see the shape characteristics than we could on the top, seeing the same hourglass-like shape in the wider rounded rear hump shaping. Looking at the mouse from the side, you can get a better view of the Cloud V2's hump profile, which is centrally optimized and terminates roughly at the midline of the mouse. You can also see that the mouse's hump profile is much more aggressively tilted towards the front of the shell rather than the rear, which has a more gradual decline in its curvature. Looking from the front, you can better see the curvature of the Cloud V2's shell, and you can also see that just like the Cloud V1, the sides of the mouse are flat and rounded at the top and bottom, and that the sides are angled outward at around an 85-degree angle. And lastly, looking from the rear, you can best see the Cloud V2's hump profile, which is a flattened rounded hump shape, just like the one we saw in the Cloud V1. In terms of contact areas, for my 19.05 by 12.7 centimeter hands using a tilted claw grip, the Cloud V2 makes most of its contact against my mid hypothenar and upper mid palm. There is a little bit of contact with my mid to low thenar, thinner, but not enough contact where I feel like I can anchor properly, so my grip is much more reliant on mid-palm and mid-thenar contact. On not so giant hands like mine, the mouse's contact areas will be primarily focused on mid-palm contact and secondarily on thenar and hypothenar, but this will depend on your grip style and hand size. In regards to hand size and grip compatibility, WAIZOWL is advertising that the Cloud V2 will be compatible with smaller hands for palm grips, and for medium to large hands it will be compatible with palm claw or a palm claw hybrid grip, as well as fingertip grips for all hand sizes. From my testing, the mouse is best suited for small hands for palm grips, for small to medium hands palm grip again, for medium hands you can do palm or claw grips, for medium to large hands you can do palm and claw grip again, and for large hands it's going to be primarily a claw grip mouse only. Now, while WAIZOWL is advertising that the mouse is compatible with fingertip grips, as I mentioned earlier, this mouse is very bulky, and while it is fingertip grippable, it's not exactly the most comfortable. Also, considering the mouse is quite heavy, weighing in anywhere from 57.24 to 59.24 grams, the mouse is just too heavy to be a very fingertip grippable mouse. Next up, let's talk about the Cloud V2's coating. Just like we saw in the OGM Pro V2, the Cloud V2 is using WAIZOWL's updated Gen 3 feather coating, which is a massive improvement over the Gen 2 feather coating we saw on the Cloud V1. As I talked about when I covered the OGM Pro V2, the Gen 3 coating is absolutely fantastic and performs very similar to the coating we found on the OP1AK. As such, it's great for both wet and dry hands, and even though I have very sweaty hands, I never ran into any anchoring or grip issues over my testing here with the Cloud V2. But there is one oddity about the Cloud V2 Crimson Lion Edition, as the design on the mouse itself is slightly raised from the shell surface, and the designed area also have a different texture from the rest of the shell. To be clear, the shell is still very grippy, but I can see people not liking the raised texture here on the Cloud V2 Crimson Lion Edition. If this is the case but you like the shape of the cloud, I'd recommend getting the updated Cloud V2 in the black colorway. I believe it's called the WAIZOWL Hawkeye, as that will just have the same black coating as we saw on the OGM Pro V2. Just keep in mind that the black version of the Cloud V2's coating will have the same issues as the black colorway of the OGM Pro V2, where the coating will pick up fingerprints, dirt, dust, and oils from your hand like a magnet does metal, so keep that in mind as the mouse will always look very grimy unless you constantly clean the mouse off with a microfiber cloth. Now, if you don't happen to like the feeling of the Cloud V2's chalky coating, WAIZOWL has you covered here, as the Cloud V2 comes with a set of WAIZOWL's amazing grip tape, as I mentioned earlier. The grips are the exact same as the ones we saw included with the OGM Pro V2, just colored red to match the Crimson Lion theming. On the black version of the Cloud V2, the included grips will most likely be black to match that colorway, just like we saw with the black version of the OGM Pro V2. The set of grips that are included here is a full-size set that comes with the same extra crescent piece you can apply to the back of the shell to help increase the gripability for your thenar, mid-palm, and hypothenar. But unlike the set that we saw included with the OGM Pro V2, the set here includes side button covers, which is a nice attention to detail. Now, the grips themselves are on the thicker side, and they are made out of a harder rubber material, so you can't press into the grips like you can on other thicker grip tapes, but this thicker material does make the grips very durable, but not so much so where the grips are very easy to warp or crease when installing or removing them. But the grips, despite their hardness, are very grippy. Their gripability is similar to what you'd find on the X-Ray Pad Gecko 2.0s, but the included grips here on the Cloud V2 have the added benefit of having the same unique ice crystal-like fractal texturing to them that further increases their gripability. And because of the natural stickiness and unique texturing, the stock grips are great for both wet and dry hands, and they maintained their grippiness over my testing, as we've always seen with WAIZOWL included grip tape. The only issue I can see people having with the included grips is that I mentioned earlier they are a little thicker than most aftermarket grips, and the texturing might not be everyone's cup of tea. If that's the case for you and you want to use grips here on the Cloud V2, I'd recommend getting the X-Ray Pad Cicada Wing 2.0s, as they're much thinner than the included stock grips but have a similar level of gripability, just about the textured feeling. Alright, let's talk about the Cloud V2's main clicks next. The shell buttons are the same shape and size as the Cloud V1's main clicks, being longer curved buttons with a slight roundness to them. The shell buttons don't have any finger grooves in them, but they do share the same coating as the rest of the Cloud V2 shell, and because of this, despite the lack of any finger grooves, it's still very easy to anchor your fingers on the more rounded shell clicks. But interestingly enough, unlike the Cloud V1 and the OGM Pro V2, the Cloud V2 Crimson Lion uses a rather unique switch for the main clicks, one I personally haven't used before, the Wano green shell white dot switches. In terms of the main click audio feedback, I'll give you a quick little sound test here. In regards to click feeling, the V2's main clicks have a similar actuation weight to the V1's main clicks, being around a 4.5 out of 10. In terms of pre and post travel, the main clicks have a small amount of pre-travel and a medium amount of post travel, surprisingly similar to the pre and post travel we found on the Cloud V1's main clicks. The click feeling is consistent on both the main buttons here in the Cloud V2, and both the shell buttons are very well stabilized, and both of them have a nice snappy rebound to them, which keeps the main clicks very spammable. It's also worth mentioning that just like the main clicks on the Cloud V1, the V2's main clicks are indented into the shell, so the main clicks are free from any interference issues that would be caused by your thumb, pinky, or ring finger resting against the side of the shell. And I wanted to quickly clarify that on the normal black Hawkeye edition of the Cloud V2, that mouse will be using the standard 1.0 blue shell pink dot switches, not the 1.0 green shell white dot switches that are in the Crimson Lion edition, but as we just talked about, the two switches feel very similar, so the click feeling isn't going to change too much between the two versions. And lastly, before I move on, I wanted to quickly mention that the click debounce here in the V2 is preset to 4 ms, so depending on your preference, you might want to adjust this to whatever value you personally prefer. Alright, next up, let's talk side buttons. The V2 side buttons are the same shape as the V1 side buttons, being these rounded pill-shaped buttons that have a slight curvature to them. The side buttons are placed fairly high in the Cloud V2 shell, and they're also tilted forward to match the curvature of the top shell, and the buttons are installed right at the midline of the mouse. The side buttons also have the same coating as the main clicks, so the side buttons are very grippy and it's easy to consistently actuate the side buttons despite their rounded shape. If you find the side buttons to be slippery though despite the gray coating, as I mentioned earlier, the Cloud V2 does include grip tape for the side buttons, so you can install that if you feel it's necessary. On the inside, the Cloud V2 is using the same 1.0 black shell white dot switches we saw on the Cloud V1, which I'm very happy to see a more normal switch here instead of the weird kale blue bottom green dot switches we saw on the OGM Pro V2 side buttons. In terms of side button audio feedback, I'll give you a quick little sound test here. In terms of click feeling, due to the 1.0 white dot switch, the side buttons here are much lighter than the ones we saw on the OGM Pro V2, feeling similar to the main clicks in terms of their actuation weight, being around a 4.5 out of 10. Both the side buttons, similar to the main clicks, have a very slight amount of pre-travel and a medium amount of post-travel. Both the side buttons feel the same in terms of their pre and post-travel, and both buttons have a great snappy rebound to them, so they feel just like the main clicks, being very snappy and very responsive. Both the Cloud V2 side buttons are also very well anchored and stabilized, with little to no play on either button. Next up, let's talk about the Cloud V2's scroll wheel. The scroll wheel is the same type we found on the Cloud V1 and the OGM Pro V2, being a plastic wheel with a rubber texturing in the middle. The rubber is very easy to grip and is quite soft, so it's very easy to scroll wheel click consistently and scroll the scroll wheel, which is great to see. Inside, the Cloud V2 is using a TTC silver 11mm encoder, which gives the scroll wheel a fairly light scroll actuation weight of around a 4 out of 10, but this encoder, unlike the one we saw on the OGM Pro V2, has less pronounced scroll points, so there isn't as much of a defined step when you scroll the scroll wheel. But despite this, the scroll wheel is still easy to scroll wheel click without accidentally scrolling, which is great to see. Speaking of the scroll wheel click, inside, the Cloud V2 is using a level 2 1.0 black shell red dot switch, the same switch type we saw the OGM Pro V2 use, just a shorter switch. The scroll wheel click has an actuation force similar to the side buttons, being around a 4.5 out of 10, and surprisingly, because it's a normal switch type, not a pillar switch, the scroll wheel click has a really good rebound and actually surprisingly snappy, which is nice to see as most of the time scroll wheel clicks are rather mushy. Now, before we move on, I wanted to quickly note that just like we saw on the OGM Pro V2, here on the Crimson Lion edition, the spec sheet on WAIZOWL's website lists the middle switch as being a 1.0 black shell white dot switch, not the black shell red dot switch that's in my OGM Pro V2. Again, I assume this is an error with their marketing, but on the off chance this was switched during manufacturing due to a switch shortage or whatever reason, just keep in mind that yours may have a 1.0 black shell white dot switch as the scroll wheel click switch, which will slightly alter the overall feeling of the scroll wheel, but not in a significant way. In terms of sensor and MCU, the Cloud V2, just like the OGM Pro V2, is using the new updated Pixar 3950 sensor. Now, just like all the other 3950s we've seen released this year, this one is branded under a custom name, the Hawkeye V1 in this case, but regardless of its custom naming, this is just a normal Pixar 3950, just like all the other custom named 3950s out there. Now, just like we saw in the Cloud V1, the sensor is centrally positioned in the Cloud V2 shell, centered right at the midline of the mouse. The 3950 is similar to other 3950 implementations we've seen, with the same DPI range of 50 to 30,000, but oddly enough there are only two LOD levels, 1mm and 2mm. Generally speaking, on 3950s there should be a 0.7 LOD setting, but it seems to be disabled on the Cloud V2 for some reason. Aside from the oddity with the LOD, the rest of the sensor is normal with motion sync, ripple, and angle snapping all enabled on the sensor, and these can be enabled or disabled via the Cloud V2 software. And just like we saw in the Cloud V1, the sensor here in the Cloud V2 does have a high and low power mode that can be enabled via the software, but this can only be utilized on 1K Hz, so it's only really useful when playing wired or on 1K Hz wireless, which isn't going to be very often as this mouse does support 8K polling rate, so while it's nice to see it here included, it's not really as impactful as the higher polling rates. Now, just like the OGM Pro V2, while the 3950 here in the Cloud V2 doesn't have the 0.7mm LOD setting, it does have something we haven't seen on any other 3950s so far, aside from the OGM Pro V2 and Razer's mice of course, where you can enable a tilt setting here on the sensor to digitally tilt the angle of the sensor. Now, I'm not going to talk about this feature today as this is a very complex feature that has a lot of very unique impacts into how you aim. I'm going to talk more about this in a future video, much more in depth when I have a lot of time to do some more testing on this, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that video. And lastly, just like we saw in the OGM Pro V2, despite the upgraded sensor, the mouse is still using the same Nordic 52840 MCU as we saw in the Cloud V1. This isn't a bad thing per se, but I am surprised we didn't see an upgrade to the MCU here on the Cloud V2. But despite the older MCU, over my testing, the Cloud V2 did perform exceptionally well and I had no issues with any kind of latency or any connectivity issues over my testing. And speaking of performance, let's talk about the Cloud V2's high polling rate implementations next. As I mentioned earlier, just like the OGM Pro V2, the Cloud V2 doesn't have any wired high polling rates, which is disappointing to see, but at least it does have up to 8K wireless polling, and since both the OGM Pro V2 and the Cloud V2 use the same sensor and MCU, unsurprisingly the polling rate performance between these two mice is pretty much 1-for-1. Both the Cloud V2's 2 and 4K polling rates are perfectly implemented and perform exactly like the 2 and 4K polling rates we saw in the OGM Pro V2. Sadly, due to the age of my system, I wasn't able to fully test the 8K polling as it absolutely destroys my frame rate, so I can't play games on it, but the 2 and 4K polling rates here in the Cloud V2 perform very well over my testing with no issues. Now, before I move on, I also wanted to note the Cloud V2, just like the Cloud V1, does support Bluetooth connectivity, but this connectivity mode will cap your report rate to 125 Hz, so you can't utilize any of the high polling rates on that connectivity mode. You will have to stick to the wireless 2.4 GHz mode. Next up, let's talk about the Cloud V2's battery. Since the Cloud V2 is using the same 300 mAh battery as the OGM Pro V2, and since the sensor and the MCU are exactly the same between the two mice, the battery life here on the Cloud V2 is going to be pretty much 1-for-1 with the battery life we saw on the OGM Pro V2. Now, according to WAIZOWL, they're advertising that this mouse is going to have 130 hours of battery life, but this was measured on Bluetooth, not 2.4 GHz wireless, so in reality, the battery life here is going to be much shorter on the Cloud V2. From my testing, on 1K Hz, the mouse lasted around 45.3 hours, on 2K Hz, the mouse lasted 22.5 hours, on 4K Hz, the mouse lasted 14.5 hours, and on 8K Hz, the mouse lasted 8.5 hours. Now, keep in mind this battery life was measured over constant movement. The actual battery life of the mouse would be much longer as the mouse isn't going to be constantly moving around like it was from my testing. Also, keep in mind that while the battery life between the OGM Pro V2 and the Cloud is pretty much 1-for-1 from my testing, there may be a slight variance in the battery life, so keep that in mind. And in terms of charging time, just like the OGM Pro V2, the Cloud V2 charged from empty to full in approximately 2 hours, charging off a USB-A port on my PC via the included stock cable. Now, just like I said when I reviewed the OGM Pro V2, the actual battery life here in the Cloud V2 compared to what's being advertised is very different. There is a massive gap between the two. I would love to see WAIZOWL update their marketing similarly to what I would like them to do with the weight to better reflect the true battery life here on the Cloud V2 and have measurement values for 1, 2, 4, and 8K polling and not use this 130 hours of Bluetooth battery life because it's not very representative of the true battery life here on the Cloud V2. Alright, and lastly, let's talk about repairability. Now, all the previous WAIZOWL mice like the Cloud V1 and the OGM Pro V2 have been very repairable, and the same goes here for the Cloud V2, but the Crimson Line version I have here has one odd change. For whatever reason, instead of the Phillips head screws we saw in the Cloud V1 and the OGM Pro V2, the Crimson Line has torque screws like the ones we saw on the Vaxi mice. I'll admit I was rather surprised to find torque screws here on a WAIZOWL product. I'm not really sure why they did this in the Crimson Line edition, as it makes opening the unit much harder as you need a very specific Torx bit to open this mouse. Now, I'm not sure if this this is going to apply to the regular Hawkeye version of the Cloud V2. I hope not, but just keep in mind if you want to open either the Crimson Line Edition and possibly the Cloud V2 Hawkeye, you may need a Torx screw to open the mouse, which is disappointing. But that said, if you do have a Torx bit, the 4 base screws are easy to remove, and once they're out, you can run your finger along the seam between the top and the bottom shell, and you can disconnect the top and the base shell very easily. On the inside, the battery is using a rather interesting mounting mechanism. It is surprisingly anchored quite well and doesn't shake around during use, and it is very easy to remove and mod it out for a smaller battery. You can't put a larger one in here due to the space limitations, so you have to cut out this plastic kind of shell to do so, but the battery is replaceable and moddable, which is nice to see. I don't really like this weird battery anchoring mechanism they have here. This is just a lot of added weight for nothing. It would have been much easier just to put the battery flat on the base shell. I'm not quite sure why they did this, but it is what it is. Aside from that though, the side buttons are very easy to repair as they're on their own daughter board, just like we saw in the OGM Pro V2 and the Cloud V1. The rest of the board is unfortunately not that repairable because you will need to solder off the encoder or the main switches, but that's pretty par for the course for most mice nowadays. But overall, the Cloud V2 is decently serviceable. My only real issue with the serviceability here is the Torx screws. Again, I don't know why they're here. I really hope we see WAIZOWL go back to their standard Phillips head screws on their future models, because these Torx screws just don't really make a lot of sense, but it still is a very easy to service unit. You just need a particular bit to get the unit open. And as always with all mice reviews I do here on the channel, I will have a full teardown of the OGM Cloud V2 Crimson line coming out in a couple days after this review goes live. So if you'd like to learn how to model the battery or repair this unit yourself, or just see how it's built on the inside, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the full teardown coming out in a couple days. Alright, well, in closing, overall the OGM Cloud V2 Crimson line is a fantastic refresh of the OGM Cloud V1. It does have many of the same shortcomings we saw in the OGM Pro V2 in terms of its lackluster stock cable, the lack of high polling rates over wire connectivity, and the advertised weight spec and the battery life are also very inaccurate and should be updated to better reflect the true values of the product. And on the Crimson Line Edition specifically, I'm very disappointed to see Torx screws here, but at the end of the day, the Cloud V2 is still an improvement over the Cloud V1, and definitely something worth looking into if you enjoyed the original Cloud. Now, in terms of what version of the Cloud V2 I recommend getting, even though there are some slight differences between the Hawkeye Cloud V2 and the Crimson Line Cloud V2, they are essentially the same mouse. The only difference is going to be the design on the Crimson Line Edition, and of course the main switches, where the Hawkeye version is using 1.0 blue shell pink dot switches, and the Crimson Line is going to be using the 1.0 green shell white dot switches. But as I talked about earlier, they feel pretty much one for one, so realistically speaking, the only difference is going to be the design. So realistically speaking, it's up to personal preference on what version you want to get, as seeing as both the Hawkeye and Crimson Line colorways are the same price, it's really up to personal preference. But if you'd like to learn more about the Cloud V2 and pick one up for yourself, I will have the Cloud V2 Crimson Line and Hawkeye editions product links linked down in the description for you. But with that, that's going to be everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much again to WAIZOWL for sending over the Crimson Line Cloud V2 for review. I greatly appreciate it. Big thank you to our channel members, UKI89 Print, It Was Luck, Lunaris, Mark World, and all of our other channel members. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you'd like to become a member here and support what I'm doing here on the channel with the in-depth reviews and the teardown project, you can become a member here on YouTube for only $2 Canadian a month. This is one of the best ways to directly support the channel, so thank you very much in advance for your support. You can also help support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 over at Letho Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming, TJ Exclusives, and Mech Keys to save yourself a couple dollars off your order and help support the channel. Thanks again for watching my review of the WAIZOWL Crimson Line OGM Cloud V2, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.